There's a lot of maps in Age of Empires 2, but by far the most popular is Arabia. And it doesn't matter whether you are an undiagnosed agoraphobe who favorites Arena over and over again, or you're a nomad player who's still trying to figure out their place in the world, it's almost certain that you're going to wind up playing a decent bit of Arabia in your AOE2 tenure. Now, what constitutes a strong civilization for Arabia? It's a bit of a difficult question, actually. You see, at the mid-Elo level is really where civilization's unique characteristics are starting to assert themselves. However, mid-Elo games often have a different style and tempo than games that are, say, at a more advanced level of gameplay. Some civilizations that are strong for mid-Elo players often feel quite mediocre at a high level, and some civs that seem unbeatable at the high level are not as optimized at the mid-Elo level and are still pretty good. So join me in this updated 1v1 Arabia tier list. A lot of changes have occurred over the last year, so let's get after it. Alright everybody, before we jump into the video, I'm just gonna say I can't believe it's been a year since I last did this tier list. Like I said in the intro, a lot has changed. And I just also want to say, for anybody who's been here since that first video, this first version of it, shout out to y'all. I appreciate y'all dearly for sticking around. And if you're new to the channel, maybe this is the first time you're watching one of my videos, definitely encourage you to stick around, subscribe to the channel, so that way when I got a video coming out, you get it. And we got a lot of great content, some of which I'm going to be updating in the next several months, so I hope you have something you'll enjoy. Now, before we get into the tier list itself, we want to think about what actually makes for mid-Elo gameplay. I'm going to put a little list up here, but to summarize it, if you want to read it, you can pause the video, but what really separates mid-Elo gameplay from, say, a higher level is efficiency. And particularly inefficiency, I would say, mid-feudal age and beyond for the most part. Dark Ages are usually pretty good, pretty buttoned up, and I would say just openings in general tend to be pretty efficient, but it's a drop-off. And in some cases, right, it can be a really steep drop-off. I tend to take a fairly broad characterization of what it constitutes to be mid-Elo. Think about it, just mathematically, and I know that there's faults in there in terms of what the normal distribution in Age of Empires 2 Elo means for what actually constitutes a mid-Elo player. And I actually did a video on that, so I highly encourage you to check that out. But ultimately, right, at the end of the day, I'm talking about the kind of gameplay that is characteristic of players who are maybe about 1k Elo, but have a lot of games that are very highly experienced, all the way up to maybe a 1600, 1700 level of gameplay. Obviously, there is a lot of difference between those players, so I'm not saying that, players at that skill level are necessarily comparable, right? A 1600 player would probably be a 1000 rated player, 95% of the time. But what I am saying is some of these issues of efficiency are issues that are characteristic, right? Perhaps to different degrees, but are still the same sort of root cause issues across this level of gameplay. And so it's that efficiency factor. And I'll talk a bit about that in the video itself. And, when I think of the tiers in this, I really approach this subject not thinking about a civilization's end state where it rewinds up in a post-imperial setting, but how a civilization plays throughout the game, right? Throughout the ages and at different phases of the game. So these S tier civs are basically great throughout the ages and pretty much every phase in the game, and their weaknesses, and every civ has some weaknesses, for the most part, and these S tier civilizations, their weaknesses are minimal, and you can generally find ways to cover them up. Takes us all the way down right to the D tier, and these are civs, right? There's no F tier here. I think every civilization is pretty much playable on Arabia, but those D tier civilizations have some major weaknesses, and you kind of have to play them just right to make them work. So that being said, right, let's go ahead and jump into the tier list, starting off with the Aztecs, which are a great example, I think, of an S tier civ. You have really strong economic and military bonuses in the early game. Your Castle Age, you can sustain a lot of military units out there in the field, which is fantastic. And in the late game, you have basically a unit counter for pretty much everything, and strong skirmishers, strong infantry, eagles that can put out a lot of damage as well. And even your pikemen are not so bad because of the Garland Wars technology, and you can just make units so fast with this civilization with that civ bonus. So you can often get that mass you need. Now, the fact that you're missing stables, so no knights, no late game hussar raids, is a bit of a weakness. Eagles don't quite compensate for that fully, especially the lack of light cavalry to just be able to spam those units in the late game. However, Aztec's late game is really helped out by the fact that their relics generate more gold. So if you can get to 3 or 4 relics with the civilization, your timer lasts quite a while that you can play, especially compared to the other American civs. So S tier for me. Bengalis, great example of a D tier civilization. You are a late game powerhouse, I would say, though you're still a little limited in the fact that, from basically the mid game onward, having no knights or camels is kind of a bummer, and it just feels like you're very reliant on units that are difficult or awkward to play, like battle elephants and elephant archers, and maybe the Ratha. And those units in the mid game don't have that high of a damage output, in part because you're missing Thumb Ring and you need to get to a castle to try and alleviate that. And still, not having Thumb Ring means that your elephant archers are just kind of perpetually inaccurate. Battle elephants are interesting with this civ, but despite the fact that they take less bonus damage, they're still too easily converted by monks for my taste. And of course, Rathas are countered by basically everything. So I think that Rathas felt really strong when they first hit the scene. I still think they're a good unit, but they do have their weaknesses, and you got to keep those in mind. So you kind of got to play this civilization perfectly, and it's a little tough to get there. Berbers, great example of a B tier. Pretty generic early game, but once you get to that mid game with the cheaper stable units and perhaps even camel archers if you want to go to an alternative power unit, really strong civilization. And I also think that this civ was really helped out by the fact that the heavy cavalry archer upgrade now does more bonus damage to spearmen, right? Because the civ misses Parthian tactics. So if you're up against quite a few halberdiers and there's not a lot of cav archers out in the field for your opponent, you might think about going heavy cav archer just to be able to thin down those spearman numbers. It's just some food for thought. Bohemians to me are a C tier civilization. You really lack mobility, and I think that their comp in the mid game of chemistry crossbows or hand cannoneers takes a while to get to. I think ultimately with this civilization, if you can get to something like halberdiers and Hoofnitha, sort of a halb siege play, it's really, really strong. But again, it's just kind of getting there when you don't have that mobility. You don't necessarily have the strongest early game economic bonuses because the free mining upgrades is good, but gold and stone really isn't all that scarce in the early game. And so it's just one of those things that I don't think it's helping you as much for winning at those phases of the game. So C tier civ. Now, Britons, I think, are really interesting. I think they're S tier. Again, thinking about them through the ages. Great early game, Dark Age eco bonus. Archery range is working faster, helps you mass army. You get the Castle Age, you can drop cheap town centers, while still being able to make army that has extra range. In Imperial Age, you get more range. Your stables actually aren't that bad with the Britons, right? You're missing bloodlines, but you get all the armor upgrades for Cavalier and Light Cav respectively. So your late game cavalry is really not that bad with the civ, and you have great siege in the Warwolf Trebs, so they just check too many boxes for me to put below S tier. But I will say, right, I think sometimes in the mid game you can get kind of outflanked by some of the more mobile cavalry civilizations, so you do have to watch for that. But still really strong, right? You get fully teched out barracks with this civ as well, so even your infantry is pretty darn good. Alright, we have Bulgarians, and Bulgarians are a B tier civ to me, but I'll say I think they're probably closer to A tier than you'd think. You have a really strong opening with the fast men-at-arms, and cheap blacksmith upgrades can help you play aggressively in the feudal age well, especially if you have multiple unit types. The mid game is where the civilization feels a little bit weaker because you don't really have as much of a sustained eco bonus. But your knights, you can get them upgraded still fairly well, and there's something to be said for that. And I think the civilization to me really does kind of pop in the late game as well, right? From late Castle Age onwards, once you get that stirrups technology on your cavalry, you have really strong cavalry, and you have really nice heavy cav archers as well, and you have some great infantry options with a two-handed swordsman. So I think this is a really, really strong civilization. I just think it's hampered by the fact that your mid-game economy is a bit weak, and missing the crossbowman makes your follow-ups in early Castle Age and in that mid-game, if say you're opening men-at-arms and you're not going scouts for whatever reason, it just feels like you're kind of limited with this civilization. You're in that early game in terms of what your army is going to be, and I think that telegraphs too much information to an opponent. So that's a strategic disadvantage, and to me, I think that puts them down in the B tier. All right, so let's move on to the Burgundians. Burgundians I think are really interesting, but I really got to put them in the A tier. They remind me a little bit of Berbers in that I think that they get a lot stronger as you get into the mid game with the Castle Age Cavaliers. You have a really cheap Paladin upgrade as well, and you have some nice bonuses later. Burgundian vineyards, you can research in Castle Age, where your farmers also make gold. Your relics give you food. It's like, this is a civilization that's just made to spam paladins, and you get the upgrade for cheap. And the difference, though, with a civ like for the Berbers is that being able to research eco upgrades early with this civ and at a discount means that your economy is just so far ahead of your opponent usually. And the Castilier is still a really dominant unique unit from the castle. And you have Flemish militia if you want to press the button. I just think the civilization's really strong. I do think that you can be vulnerable to civilizations that are strong with early rushing, and so I gotta knock the civilization. I don't think it's quite S tier, because I think in those really pitched feudal age battles, trying to get those upgrades for mid-elo players, right? I think for maybe a high-level player, this is an S tier civ. But for mid-elo players, I would expect having to research those eco upgrades to cause you to feel like you actually kind of have, in the early game at least, a few less resources than your opponent, while you're kind of waiting for that faster production speed to pay off for itself. So, right, knock it down a peg, but still a really strong civ. Next up is the Burmese, and I'll put them in the B tier. I think a lot of people sleep on the Burmese, and I will say that even though for me they're not exactly my favorite civ to play, I think that they have some, nice cavalry play. They have some nice openings with either men-at-arms or scouts, right? You can play both of those. In the mid game, they can feel a little tricky, because I think missing that second armor upgrade is just really important, because it basically means that units can just trade. If you're playing archers, right, it's a lot harder to trade with, say, small groups of skirmishers, let's say, just because, you're going to be taken out fast. So somebody may have a small group of archers, and they can trade off, right, units with skirmishers a decent bit, and so whittling down your skirm numbers. And +2 armor is really helpful for keeping those skirms alive and not allowing your opponent to really take fights against them. So it's a bit of a downer, though. Elephants are good, but they're still too easily converted by monks for my taste. But I think this is a B tier civ, because I think in today's meta we see monks all the time, and the fact that Burmese have cheaper monastery upgrades and they can see where relics are, I just think that they have enough advantages at the monastery that I'd move them from the C tier, which is where I think I had them in my last tier list, and I think that they've moved up into the B tier because of some of the shifts we've seen in the meta. And also the fact that the crossbow upgrade has gotten more difficult to research. I think that also, given that Burmese are a little weak to archer civs in the mid game perhaps, right, I think that was something that kind of indirectly buffs the Burmese. If we look at the Byzantines, I think Byzantines are an A tier civ. This is maybe a bit conditional on how you play with them, but they're just a civ because of the cheap counter units, skirms, spears, and camels, all at a 25% discount, which is pretty good. that gives you a nice edge in feudal age if you play it a bit more defensively. And then in the mid game, right, being able to go for cheap camels is such a good counter against knights. I mean, Byzantines are a civilization that often I hate going up against because it feels like they have an answer for everything at an early stage in the game, and their answers are always so cheap. And then when you get to the late game, which Byzantines can get to faster because of having a cheaper Imperial Age upgrade, which is, kind of like a, an eco bonus, I think functionally, that you can use for later in the game. You just have everything in that tech tree that you would really want. You can play fully upgraded Arbalists, Cataphracts if you can get them up and running are insane. So it just feels like you have all the answers with this civ. I think again, right, kind of similar to Burgundians, I think you can be a little bit vulnerable early, and if you need to play aggressively, this civ can be kind of hard if that's something that the game calls for, right? Say you have, your berries and your main golds are forward, and it's going to be a you're kind of behind from a map perspective in terms of the fact that it's a little bit tougher to play defense. With Byzantine, it kind of feels like you're forced to play defense anyways. You're going to be good at playing defense, but it just puts you in a more difficult spot sometimes. So that to me is why they can't be S tier. Next we have the Celts, and I'll put the Celts in the C tier, and heck, I'll even put them above the Bohemians. I think you have a really strong early game. With the faster wood chopping, you can do some nice early rushing with this civilization, but once you get to the mid game, unless you're going to play a really all-in style that I doubt mid-Elo players have anywhere close to being mastered, it's just, your knights miss bloodlines and your crossbowmen miss a lot of upgrades as the game goes on. So it feels like you have to make some awkward transitions with this civ, and I think you can run into some bad matchups with civilizations, say, that have bombard cannons. That just gets kind of tough, and I think even with your faster infantry, you're still not as fast as cavalry civs. So sometimes I feel like you're just still a little bit, maybe just a step too slow. Chinese. Now, Chinese are a civilization. In my last version of this, I know I had not in the S tier, but I think now, just given the way that all the content that's out there, I think we got to put them into the S tier. I will say that in the hands of a player that really hasn't messed with them before, I think that this could be maybe more of an A tier civ or maybe even a B tier civ, because Chinese are a little vulnerable early if you can play aggressively against them. However, right, I think most people today can get at least like a 1 villager lead in their Dark Age, and then the cheaper technologies just throughout the game. It just feels like once you get into early, if you're safe early feudal age with this civ, it just feels like you're off to the races. You have so many different units that you can get to. In the late game, it feels like you're really only weak to something maybe like onagers, but you have so many units that you can respond to that with that, well, I just think that the civilizations, it just doesn't seem to have a flaw anywhere once you get that start down. So that to me spells out an S tier civ. Cumans are really interesting. Either an A or a B tier. I think I like them for the A tier, and the reason is that their early game has a lot of versatility where they're a very difficult civilization to predict how they're going to open. Cheaper stables and ranges mean that scouts and archers are always an option. 2 TC boom is an option for trying to get ahead and playing a little bit more passive and right. And as a player against them, you got to go figure that out. And when they drop that TC, some people do it earlier, some people do it later. It just kind of depends on what your strategy is. And heck, you can also make siege workshops in feudal age and get capped ram in the castle age. So I think you stack onto that the fact that you get paladins that have a lot of speed and your scouts that have a lot of speed. The step husbandry tech enabling you to pump these guys out from a limited number of stables. And now that your stables are so cheap, right, it might just be better to put more stables down. I don't know. But, right, in the late game, though, that can really help you refresh hussars if they're dying to, say, enemy house or something. So I still think it's a good technology. And for all that, right, I think you got to put humans into the A tier. Not quite an S tier civ because A, I don't think that necessarily mid-Elo players would optimize them. And B, just I think that the fact that I think it's just sometimes not. Sometimes I think it's the tyranny of choice, where there's kind of so many things that you can do. You know, sometimes you don't know what to do with the civ, and you might overreach. So for that reason, I'd put them in the A tier. Dravidians, I'll put Dravidians in the C tier, and I'd even put them above Celts, to be honest. Your early game is insanely flexible, and unlike Bengalis, I do think you have some power units in the mid game with crossbows that have thumb ring, and you can actually kind of get the thumb ring or ballistics kind of easy with this civ because of getting the free wood upon each aging up. And also elephant archers with thumb ring is a very, very strong unit with Dravidians. I think that it's kind of slept on, to be honest with you. The faster firing skirmishers are great. Dravidians are just a civilization to me that it feels like, because you're lacking knights and camels and your light cavalry just stink, on a map like Arabia, it just feels like you fall behind a bit, and you have enough options to where Dravidians feel like a civ that can hang around for a while, but never quite catch back up. And then that's a problem. And to me, that's what makes them C tier. I feel like the tempo of the game really has to be in your favor for pretty much all of the game. And Dravidians have some bonuses to help make that work, but if you lose tempo with this civ, I think generally you lose the game. Ethiopians, I think Ethiopians are B tier. My main issue with Ethiopians is just that I think that players who open up kind of defensively and play like skirmishers and then maybe into monks, I think that could be something that Ethiopians struggle with until they can maybe get to a unit like Shotel warriors or get their really strong siege with torsion engines much later in the game. And I think it's just surviving to get there. You have an okay eco bonus with them, free food, some free food and gold upon aging up, but it's good. But I think as the game goes on, it just gets less and less spectacular. So ultimately, it's a B tier civ. Strong archer rush potential, not as much of a strong scout potential for that opening, and it's a civ that really feels like it needs to be played aggressive. But skirmishers are such a hard counter to archers that it can be kind of tough. Franks are a civ that I think in my last tier list I had an S tier because they're a really smooth civ to play, but I think nowadays they're more A tier. Again, you know, I mentioned monks. I think monks are everywhere now, and as players have come to appreciate the monk and the monastery, I think that that's hurt the Franks a little bit. I also think that the late game for Franks feels a bit limited, especially now, right? The chivalry technology, you can only get an Imperial Age. Back when you could get it during Castle Age, I think that it meant a lot more because it meant that you could speed up your Cavalier and Paladin upgrades, and that was important. And you could spam units a bit earlier too in a faster sort of fashion. And I think nowadays chivalry is really only good if you're going for some like crazy light cap spam later in the game. But your light cap with Franks aren't all that great anyways. So again, I think it's a smooth civ to play. I think it's a very linear civilization, but when you run into monks and pikes, it just feels like you don't have a ton of answers after that, at least not high quality ones. Moving on to the Goths. Goths are like in the C tier. I think that there's the cheaper infantry and the instant loom upgrade, I think gives you enough opportunity for shenanigans with this civilization, if that's how you want to play it in the early game. You have some options in Castle Age, like fully upgraded knights, which are pretty good. And I think your late game with this civ is more robust than you might think. Hussars that missed the last armor upgrade are still decent at raiding. You get hand cannoneers, you get bombard cannons. Got some things in their toolkit. This is another civilization that it feels like you maybe only have like one win condition with this civ. And and that's a tough way to play. So things kind of have to go really right. But you do have more options than you might think. Gurjaras, heavily nerfed in the last patch, but I still think it's in the S tier. I think that the food bonus is great, and I mean the Gurjaras, right? Your bonus damage is staggered throughout the ages, but I think it's still fine. Your camels are still going to be really strong. And the Chakram Thrower got nerfed a bit, but I think the Chakram Thrower is still going to be a really strong infantry killer. And what that means is that the Chakram Thrower is still going to be able to play the role in the Chakram army really well. Where basically, Gujaras are an extremely linear civilization where, you plop down stables, you decide whether you want to go Vamsha Riders or Camels, and then you try to get the Chakram Throwers behind that typically, so that when you force your opponent to go into something like Pikemen, right, you have a nice count. So that's kind of the Gurjara playbook. If you play that way with this civilization, it works a lot of times, and it's very strong. So to me, that's a S tier. I think maybe in the late game, this civilization can feel a little weak, but still with cheap Hussars and just cheap units in general after the Kshatriyas tech, I don't know, it still feels really strong. Hindustanis, have also been nerfed in the last 2 patches, I think. I still think they're S tier as well. You have such a good eco bonus. I think that they're less linear than a civ like Gurjaras, because basically Gurjaras is, can basically operate entirely out of the stable, whether you want to counter cavalry or archers. For Hindustanis, to counter cavalry, you go out of the stable, but to counter archers, unless you're going to tech into the skirmisher line, right, to get to the Ghulam, it really feels like, it feels like it is for that civ, right? You have to get a castle up. So it's just not quite as linear of an approach. However, I think the Hindustanis have a bit more versatility in their military tech tree. Pretty strong cav archers, and again, cav archers have been buffed in the, cav archers that miss Parthian tactics, right, are now better than they used to be, so a little bit buffed there. So I think that actually makes that a strong part of your army, and plus really good hand cannoneers late to deal with infantry. So it's a pretty strong civilization, I gotta say. Not quite as linear as Gurjaras, but I think you have better eco bonus for the entirety of the game, and also I like their versatility a lot. Huns to me are A tier. Cav archers and knights are great for the Huns. You can do a lot of different openings with this civ. Faster working stables really helps your light cav spam late. To me, it's just not an S tier civilization because you run into bad matchups with the Huns. Civs like Berbers or Gurjaras or Hindustanis, I think, can be really, really tough to deal with. And so it just winds up, right? Basically any civilization that's geared towards destroying mounted units, the Huns are really reliant on their mounted units. So that's a problem. Incas are a B tier, right? You have a lot of small eco bonuses with this civilization. Houses doing double population, free llama on the start's kind of nice. Cheaper stone buildings is nice. But the civilization just can be a little bit awkward, right? Compared to Byzantines, in that, this is a civilization that's based around counter unit play, with like slingers and Kamiuks and eagles, right? And you could go halberdiers if you want to as well. They're pretty generic, but you could. And you do have nice skirmishers as well that you can take the minimum range off of. But the thing about Byzantines that's great is that their counter units are also a lot cheaper. And because the American civilizations are so gold intensive, it always feels like you're playing on a timer. And so the fact that your counter units are kind of pricey, I think is a real bummer for the civ. And so it causes the civilization sometimes to feel like it's maybe not quite on the same level as some others. Next up we have the Italians, and I think Italians are a really strong civilization, and in fact I'd put them maybe put them even ahead of Bulgarians. We'll just keep them behind Bulgarians now. I think Bulgarians maybe a little bit more power, but Italians, right? The cheaper age up is really nice. Gives you a nice little power spike kind of at each age. Really great foot archer line. Fully upgraded cavaliers and hussars. Underrated. The condottiero is situationally useful, though typically not on Arabia, though. Every now and then you see it. If you're up against gunpowder, it's great, but regardless, though, right? You have a lot of nice techs with this civilization. Though, I do think it is, the fact that you miss halberdier is a pretty big knock on the civ. It just kind of means that you got to play something like Arbalest Light Cav, And your opponent knows that comp is coming, so that's the problem. Having said that, though, it's a good civ. You know, cheap hand cannoneers, cheap bombard cannons is nice. It's got a lot of things going for it. Just maybe a little limited. So we have the Japanese, and I put the Japanese at the top of B tier. You have a fantastic early game with the civ. Basically, any kind of feudal rush, you have an above average version of it, because you just save so much wood on your resource camps. I also think in the Castle Age, this civilization, you know, you got nice crossbows, fully upgraded Castle Age knights, cav archers that you can tech into if you want to go long term with them, because in the late game you get fully upgraded cavalry archers. Pretty strong there. I do think your late game feels a little bit underpowered with this civ. If you do go the cav archer route, you don't have the strongest light cav to pair with those cav archers. It's still decent, but just not the strongest. And you know, if you go, say, Arbalist, which you get fully upgraded, which is good, and you have great halberdiers to go with it, but there's not anything special about their Arbalist. And at this point in the game, your eco bonuses are, you know, kind of running. They're kind of running out. They're not that strong, I think. Though, you know, you might be refreshing in a lot of lumber camps or mining camps, other places on the map, so you're still getting some wood out of it, but it just sometimes feels like the civilization doesn't have that same kind of gas that it does in the early game. So to me, that makes them top of B tier. So Khmer at the Mid-Elo, I think, are really interesting. I'll put Khmer above Italians. You have a really nice economy. You could do some crazy uptimes with this civilization. And somebody who has really spent a lot of time with this civ, I think, understands that. The downside, I think, is just your military tech tree is pretty weak. Sometimes it feels you can lose a little bit of steam if you're not taking advantage of the ability to not need buildings to age up, and so going through those age up times or fast rushing. So great economy, but the military is a little lacking. Koreans for me are, and I hate to put them there, but they are in the D tier. Sorry. Nice archers. I think the free armor upgrade is really good, but you know, I think that bonuses at a mid-elo level that say protect units are not as good as bonuses to help you do damage. Just because in the early game, I think mid-elo players have this instinct of wanting to do aggression, and anything that facilitates that, I think, is more helpful at this level. Whereas I think mid-elo players can sometimes struggle a little bit more with defense. But for Arabia, right, no mobility. War wagons have gotten a few nerfs, actually, over the last, like, year or so. So they're still a strong unit, but they're a little bit more counterable these days, I think. And I don't know, it just feels like a civilization that you can get, outrushed by, and you don't have a ton of eco bonuses, so you can also kind of get outboomed by. And it's a civ that you just have to play exactly right? War wagons, I think, is usually the answer in that equation. But that can be tough to get to on Arabia. Lithuanians for me are somewhere between A and B tier. I want to put them in B tier for right now. So I just think that you have a really nice early game, but you just run out of steam usually in the mid game, and your mid game is kind of predictable. Like, go for knights. It's like, I think a lot of people know it's coming, and that's a problem. Though good to have you cav archers now. So with the latest patch, but still, I just think they fall a little bit short. You don't really have a good eco bonus for the mid game, and you don't have a lot of versatility in the mid game as well. But really nice trash army and a nice early game. Magyars, I'll put Magyars in the bottom of A tier. You're missing an eco bonus, so there's no way the civ can be S tier. But you just have so many military options, and if you play aggressively, kind of like how Byzantines, if you play defensively, with Magyars, if you play aggressively, you can feel the savings of cheaper scouts and free melee attack upgrades at the blacksmith, and it feels like you're getting eco upgrades, and you'll find you'll be able to click up a little bit faster with this civ if you're going to something like scouts, where and you're able to feel the impact of that free forging. Really nice late game with Magyars. I think their mid game is a little underrated because, again, I think having the free melee attack upgrades if you're playing into knights, I think it enables you to have a nice power spike where sometimes your opponent doesn't have any attack upgrades to the blacksmith. And now you're doing a lot more damage. So you combine that with a strong early game. Sounds like a bottom of A tier civ to me. And also the fully upgraded Arbalist, right? This is a civilization like compared to Huns, which have a stronger eco bonus. But Huns get pretty awkward against civs that counter mounted units. Always remember with Magyars, you have OK Halbs, and you have the Arbalist line at your disposal, fully upgraded. Don't be afraid to go that route with this civ. Malay to me feel like a D tier. I think that the aging up is usually more awkward for mid-elo players and not a lot of mobility, lacking the second cavalry armor upgrade. It's really bad for this civ, I think, for a map like Arabia. Fully upgraded Arbalist, so they feel pretty generic. Not really a good eco bonus for them. It just isn't a strong civ for Arabia. It feels like you fall behind too often. Malians. I really like Malians. I think they're A tier. Nice early game bonuses with the cheaper buildings. The fact that you save so much gold with this civ. Much more of a late game bonus, but having more gold later than your opponent, I think is really strong. Strong cavalry. Pretty strong range units even, right? You miss Bracer at the end, but you still get Arbalist, so it's passable, I suppose. Champ Scarls with that 8 Pierce armor are really, really strong as well. I just think this civ has some awkward transitions if you find yourself having to go to range units and you're up against, say, a superior cavalry civ. At some point, you got to make that transition, and I just think it's awkward with this civilization. But still really good, definitely A tier. And staying in the A tier, stick with the Mayans, right? I don't think they're quite S tier. Compare them to Aztecs, right? Both have good economies. Both have some strong military units. It's just the Aztecs, right? I think don't have a lot of bad matchups, and Mayans do. I mean, if Mayans run up against Hindustanis these days, it feels like an auto loss. I think stuff like Goths can be really tough for Mayans, who it just doesn't feel like they have a great. Doesn't feel like you have a great counter. So the fact that you have some bad matchups to me is enough to put them in the A tier. Mongols, this is another civilization, right? We're staying in the A tier, folks. The great thing about Mongols to me is that, so compare them to Lithuanians, right? Really strong early game, and Mongols, right, have a really strong late game. But what makes Mongols so special to me is, yes, in the mid game, like Lithuanians, you don't really have a lot of eco going on, but Mongols have such a military diversity at the tech tree. You can go camels, that can be upgraded to heavy camels later, knights, that you get bloodlines for. You can go crossbows that you can upgrade into Arbalest later. Step Lancers with the extra HP. Step Lancers are seeing a lot of play these days. And just feels like you have a lot of military answers with this civilization. I mean, even with the civ, if you need champions as a trash buster, you can do it. Light cavalry with extra HP, you can play in the mid game or late game with hussars. I mean, it just feels like you have a lot of strengths with this civilization. And you have probably the strongest unique unit in the game in the Mangudai. So for me, it's an A tier. I do think in the mid game, right, the lack of an enduring economic bonus, I think really kind of hurts the civ. But you make up for it, right, by being able to respond militarily with pretty much any unit you want. Persians. So I'll be honest, I think a lot of people are sleeping on the Persians these days, but I'll give them credit. I think that I'd put them at something like top of C tier. You feel really dependent on cavalry, but you have stronger archers in the mid game than you think. And once you get to the point where their performance stats start to fall off a cliff, let's say, you can get commander run and you can just make them for only wood, so it becomes a trash unit. And I think that's a lot of potential. I've seen it work a few times in some good spaces. Lack of strong heavy infantry is good. You do get halberdiers with the civilization, right? Fully upgraded camels and fully upgraded halbs, I think, gives you some nice versatility. Hand cannons are nice as well. I think this is a civ that people sleep on. I think that the town centers that have more HP is really strong. It can be a bit of a curse, the fact that they work faster, but having more HP makes you really durable to raids. And that's not a small thing on Arabia, where raiding, especially in the mid game, is often quite common. So Persians are closer to B tier, I think, than you might imagine. Poles. For mid-Elo players, on Arabia, I think Poles are somewhere closer to the A tier. I just think that Poles, if you can defend in Feudal Age and then get to a castle because you can mine gold from stone somehow, that's very strong. I think sometimes for mid-Elo players might struggle with that defense and wind up having farmers taken off of Polish farms, and well, that's troublesome, I think. So I think there's enough weaknesses in the early game and having to play early game defense that it's maybe not quite S tier, but basically after that, it's fantastic. Portuguese. I think Portuguese are A tier these days. I'd say high up in the A tier. Honestly, I'd put them ahead of Huns. I don't think you have a bad matchup. The new bonus where you can you generate wood from berries actually kind of makes sense to me because you have a lot of twigs and stuff in there, so that makes sense to get a little bit of a bump. You have some wood floating around. Cheaper gold units. It's a civilization that feels kind of vanilla, but now with that Dark Age eco bonus, it's got some sprinkles on top and some syrup, and it just feels good. I think that it's not quite S tier because I don't think the eco bonus is that overpowered. I think it just kind of plays well into their mid game, and so it makes the civilization have a lot smoother playstyle. And I still think, right, you could run up against some civilizations where, I don't know, it just feels like you just get ahead of you economically, and you don't have the the craziest performing military. It's just that you can kind of get them on the cheap. So again, I think that the performance, right, makes a lot of difference in the battlefield of the season. Saracens, I'd say a B tier civ. I could put them kind of at the back end of B tier. Solid tech tree, nice camels, right? Great range units. No real eco bonus. The market bonus can be nice for clicking up and doing some interesting strategies. So I definitely encourage messing around with that. But missing halberdier is not that great. Mamelukes are interesting now, but I think still can run into some trouble. I don't know. It's a good civ, but it feels a little all in, and it feels like you're kind of reliant on. You're reliant sometimes on range units and camels, and if you lose that sort of range unit war, then your camels are going to be vulnerable. Because remember, you only get cavalry with the civ, so not as flexible in the mobility department, at least for heavy cavalry. Sicilians. I also put Sicilians in the B tier. I think you have a nice mid game with this civ, but you can fall behind early. So you gotta learn to deal with that. And on top of that, though, I think missing Bombard Cannon isn't the greatest for the civ. It's a good civ, though. Honestly, I like playing a lot with Sicilians. Now their bonus reduction is less than it used to be, so I think that's part of it. I think they're just not quite as good at countering those difficult to counter units now. Slavs to me are C tier. I think that they feel really overrated. Imagine a civilization like Khmer, but they can't do all of the really cool uptimes in the early to mid game. Okay, well that's not as good of a civ. I don't know. It just feels as if it's kind of weak, and even a civ like Khmer, right, has Arbalest with Bracer. Slavs have no Arb and no Bracer, so kind of problematic. Spanish? Maybe bottom of C tier. Look, it's a good civ in some ways. You can play scouts with this civ. It's kind of hard to play men-at-arms and archers. It feels like you're just really reliant on conquistadors and knights. Both of those units are expensive. I don't know. I think it feels like a tough civ to play. And that sounds like a lot of these C tier civs. You have options, especially in the late game, but it's kind of tough to get there. Tars. Honestly, I think the Tars I'll put them at the bottom of A tier. I think the Tars are really strong. You have a nice bonus with the sheep. That helps your feudal rushing potential. In the mid game, free thumb ring is spectacular. Fully upgraded camels are nice. Heavy cavalry, or excuse me, cavalry archers and castellades that you can get to pretty immediately are nice. Fully upgraded cavaliers for the late game is nice. Great hussars. I mean, it's just the civilization's got a lot. The Keshik is a unique unit, so cost efficient. It's really strong. I just think the problem with the civ is I think you run into bad matchups. Strong infantry civs can be perilous for the civ, so you kind of got to watch out. But still a strong civ. Teuton. What's the bottom of B tier? It's a little slow for Arabia. And I'm not sure the eco bonus is... I mean, the cheaper forms is great. But I think you're really starting to feel the effects of that. Probably decent, you know, a bit of ways through feudal age. But, you know, it's a good civ. It's just kind of slow. And, you know, you don't really have range options. And in the late game, not having access to light cavalry is a pain. And that's a problem. Turks are B tier, and I rate Turks pretty highly actually. In the, you know, I mean I think they're a mid-table civ, but I just think they're stronger on Arabian than people think. You have some weaknesses in your trash options, but really tanky cav archers, great hussars. Honestly, other than Bulgarians, maybe my favorite hussars in the game. It just feels like I'm actually going to do a video on the Turks here in the next couple of months. I hope you definitely are going to be interested in that, where I think that their playstyle is really unique these days. And also is comparable to another civilization. So stay tuned. But ultimately, right, I think that missing the good trash units gives you some weird matchups with the civ. And it limits you in such a way that it has to be a B tier, but just know that you can do more with the civ than you probably think. Vietnamese... A or B tier. I think I gotta say B tier. So here's the thing, at the mid-elo level, knowing where your opponents start, I think actually takes a lot of the edge off for a decent chunk of players. And that's good. You have really competent knights, you have great archers, competent light cav late, bombard cannon, bombard tower. I mean, this civilization sounds pretty good actually. No wood costing you eco upgrades. I think we gotta bump them up to A tier. It's actually not a ton of really strong battle elephants too. Not a ton of weaknesses for this civ. I don't think necessarily you have the strongest options with this civ. Because hey, you also get really good cavalry archers. Yeah, this is an A tier civ. You have a decent number of strong options. But the options you tend to play most, you know, like light cav, missing blast furnace, you could be a little limited late, where you just don't have the same quality unit. Yeah, okay. I'm feeling that. I had to think about it for a second. And last, but I gotta say, Vikings to me are B tier. I think that your military tech tree is very limited. Feels like you're on a real timer with this civ. Players are better at defense now. No Dark Age upgrade means that if somebody goes like fast fletching against your men-at-arms, 20% more HP is nice, but you're still going to get gunned down by fast fletching archers. Missing thumb ring on the crossbow now. Now that crossbows are more... Honestly, if crossbows were the same price as before, maybe I put them in A tier. But now that you have to pay a lot more, I think it really hurts the Viking gameplay. Kind of feels like you'll fall behind militarily. And just being forced pretty much to transition into berserks at the late stage of the game, I just think it's a little awkward because they're insanely expensive to upgrade. So it's tough, right? So that, understand though, you have a great economy with this, and that should not go unnoticed. And that, folks, is the tier list. I'm pretty happy with it. As you can see, a lot of civs in A and B tier. right? Not a lot of civs in D tier. I think not a lot of civs in S tier as well, right? I think Arabia, since every civilization on this list has weaknesses, Arabia is really a place where your weaknesses go to be exposed under that hot desert sun. And so I think that you tend to see even those S tier civilizations, right, get a little bit of light exposure. So yeah, it's just a pretty even list in some ways. But I guess one of the other takeaways is that a lot of civilizations are very strong in Arabia. So if you're playing random, chances are you're probably going to get a good Arabia civ, right? With that being said, right guys, I'm Jimmy James 59. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have some different thoughts where you would put some civs, but until that day comes, right, I'll just have to wait until I see you guys out there in the lab. Okay, peace.